Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest in this episode is Nick Mabey, the co-founder and co-CEO of one of the world's most influential climate change think tanks, E3G, where the name stands for Third Generation Environmentalism. As well as his roles with E3G, Nick is founder and chair of London Climate Action Week, and he has several independent appointments, including as a London Sustainable Development Commissioner. Nick has previously worked in the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, the UK Foreign Office, WWF-UK, London Business School, and the UK electricity industry. As an academic, he was lead author of Argument in the Greenhouse, one of the first books examining the economics of climate change. He was awarded an OBE in the Queen's Jubilee Honours List in 2022 for services to climate change and support to the UK COP26 presidency. Nick, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining, Nick.
Nick, what's meant by this term, third generation environmentalism?
The term was pulled together by my friend Tom Burke, who's a co-founder of E3G, to explain how environmentalism has changed over time. The first generation of environmentalists were very much the conservation movement. They preserved places and species, and they emerged at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century in Europe and the US, and did an amazing job to, in a sense, kind of hold back the pressures of industrialization and the expansion of industrial agriculture and preserve some of the key wildlife spaces and places and beautiful places in the world. But as time went on and as environmental problems changed, you saw a move to a second generation of environmentalism, which was very much in the 60s and 70s, the campaign movements looking at toxics, pollution in the air and the water and the soil, population and those issues. Second generation environmentalists really were the foundation of the modern, more radical movement looking for fundamental changes in society and very much kind of outside of protest groups. When we were envisaging E3G, we were very much building off both of those legacies. All the founders of E3G had worked in organizations who were in both the first and the second generation. But we realized that protest wasn't enough. In a way, the protest movements had done a great job of sensitizing the mainstream to environmental issues. The problem was that wasn't leading to environmental outcomes. So the part of third generation environmentalism is working with the hundreds of thousands, millions of people who believe in environmental outcomes but work in mainstream government, business, finance, academic institutions, but need to be networked and brought together to make real change. So what we do in E3G is we work with those people not to change their minds because they get it. That's what the second generation and first generation did, but make them effective in doing transformational change at the pace we need to solve the actual problems, using those mainstream levers they have control over. Hence, we work with diplomats and businessmen and investment bankers who are just as environmentalist as anybody in Greenpeace. So that's what third generation environmentalism is. And in the 20 years now we've been running E3G, we've found that grouping, that mainstream of environmental objectives across society has exploded beyond our wildest dreams and is really the foundation of the successes we're seeing at the moment.
Nick, where would you put people like Extinction Rebellion who focus very specifically on global warming, climate change? Because they're not from the 1960s, 70s protesting pollution. It seems to be a newer movement than that, but it's obviously not your generation either, because they're not really looking to work with non-environmentalists. They are a specific protest group, and there's lots of others like them focusing on that one issue. Where do they fit?
It's interesting. They're a bit of a second generation because they do very creatively use kind of tactic of direct action and protest to highlight the problem of climate change. But also they are, and it's interesting to see how it's going to evolve, perhaps the school strikes movement in Europe is a bit more interesting in that sense than Extinction Rebellion in the UK, evolving into a kind of fourth generation environmentalism, which is embedding of a more radical social movement around climate action across the world. So some of the interesting things we're seeing out of XR is the foundation of the kind of professional XR. So Architects Rebellion, Culture Rebels is a really interesting movement. It's associated with XR. It's a different movement. There's museums and art galleries and others who sign up to a climate emergency and use those assets to take forward. That's a bit third generation environmentalism. There's a bit beyond, it's embedding it in a broad societal movement. We always saw that as a kind of evolution of our work, was into that broader cultural realm. And actually, through London Climate Action Week, we work very much with those broader forces in society, as well as kind of elite and powerful forces, to build that understanding of what it means to live in a climate changed world and respond to the pressures and imperatives that puts on people, not just from a technocratic point of view, but from a very deep societal, cultural, political with a small p kind of world. I found Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes movement incredibly powerful because they did show we were evolving into this much broader, stronger, less technocratic, more societal set of movements, which is what we're going to need to achieve the changes we need to do.
You said you're not really in the business of changing people's minds because most people get it. But there is still a wide spread of opinion as to how serious climate change is and how urgently action needs to be taken. Many people are saying that the risks of climate change are often overstated, in part to produce a sense of panic. What do you think are the credible scenarios ahead?
This is something I've worked on a lot, both inside government and outside government. We were actually behind the first debate on climate security at the UN Security Council on 2027. I would tend to think that actually climate change is going to be worse than people think, because that's what's happened. Since I started working on climate change 30 years ago, we thought the world would survive a 3 to 4 degree world when the climate system was relatively stable. The science has shown that's not true. I don't see any reason why the more science we do, the more sensitivity we won't find out, and also the more vulnerabilities we won't find in our own human system. The general trend of the science, the general trend of knowledge, has proven that we've been a bit conservative in our estimates of climate risk and a bit complacent about how well we can ride them out. So that's my baseline assessment. And I think you're right, in a sense, that's one of the big societal debates we've got to have, is how much risk are we going to take? And at the moment, we have things, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. No one, including at the highest levels of government, except for the vulnerable countries who will be submerged by 1.5 degrees, has any idea what that means for their national interest. Which is why when we get to difficult discussions of trade-offs, often politicians pull back, even though they claim they care about climate change. They don't really understand what it means for their immediate and pressing national interests. And that is one of the big debates we're going to have over the next 2 to 5 years as we get to more crunch points in the discussions where some of the easy stuff has been done and we need to move to harder things. We need to have that societal debate. And that's one of my biggest frustrations, in fact, over the last 20 years, how hard it is to have that conversation. It took us around 15 years to get rid of the climate deniers from that conversation, but we haven't really moved to a real conversation. I think XR was starting to kick that off, and then COVID kind of overrode it, and we've never really come back. But again, I think because of the big moment in 2025 when the next round of global climate targets have to be agreed, that issue is going to come back. And it really needs to, because whether you're talking about the highest levels of government or finance or business, in their gut, they don't really get the risks that I see out there talking to scientists to their immediate interest. Not because of willfulness, not because they've got interests get in the way. It's just a matter that they haven't engaged with it because other things get in the way. There's a lot of things going on in the world which they have to engage with.
You say that there's less climate denial, but there's still quite a lot of climate lukewarmism. People say, yeah, sure, the climate is increasing and we are going to have to adapt. And we have to address our vulnerabilities. Therefore, let's do what the Dutch did in protecting their land against rising waters. This is what we need to do.
I think a lot of that is culture war, lukewarmism. It's not actually based on people's view of the science. It's based on which tribe they want to align themselves with. It feels a very phony war. We do deep political analysis of most of the countries in the world. We've done 35 countries. What we find as we look at all the different parts and public debates in those countries, is that climate risk is the least mature debate in all those countries compared to, say, economic growth, social protection, energy security, innovation, which all combine to underpin countries' view of their position on climate change. And that's due to some really strong structural issues. There is no advocacy group for climate impacted groups. Take the UK. Who organises farmers, fishermen, tourism industries, homeowners into a group lobbying the government for more funding for adaptation? Nobody. Who would they talk to? Well, no one's really in charge inside the UK government.
It would theoretically be DEFRA's job, wouldn't it?
Theoretically, it is, but They haven't got a mandate to ensure we're resilient, because the Treasury has a policy saying the amount of money we spend on resilience is determined by the budget they give to the Environment Agency, and that doesn't cover everything. There was a Parliamentary Select Committee report last year, chaired by Margaret Beckett, and all the chairs of the select committees in Parliament who deal with security. It was the National Security Strategy Committee, and they looked at the resilience of UK critical infrastructure to climate change, and their headline conclusion was the government needs to get a grip and actually have a policy about ensuring the resilience of our national infrastructure, which is pretty damning considering we have some of the best climate scientists and some of the best climate resilience experts in the world. It's not a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of incentives in the system and a deliberate attempt by Treasury to avoid a bill for investment in resilience in the short term, because that makes their budgets look better. So there's some structural issues about how climate impacted groups are represented in public debates, in Parliament, in the executive, which means that their voice is systematically underheard, even though they're individually quite powerful groups. The impact of climate change in terms of how governments think about risk is systematically underplayed. There's a whole separate discussion about how National Security Council looks at climate change. It has repeatedly tried to build in climate analysis into National Security Council and then forgotten it's done it. And at the moment, it's just considering again whether it should consider climate change in national security strategy systems.
Nick, when David mentioned the word lukewarmers, that sent you to culture warriors as a sort of thought process. So I imagine that you would put people like Bjorn Lomborg and Matt Ridley in that camp, but they're absolutely not deniers. And put aside whether deniers is a rather ugly term because it's deliberately calling up the Holocaust. They're not denying that climate change and global warming are serious issues. I think Andrew McAfee's expressed it quite well when he said that their view is that global warming, climate change is real. We're doing it, and it's a problem that needs to be addressed. But we can and are addressing it. Not fast enough, but we are getting there. I sometimes wonder whether it's unfortunate that people like Lomborg and Ridley are ostracized and labeled, as you say, as culture warriors, because it means the only place they ever pop up is in pretty far-right outlets. Lomborg appears on Fox News, which I always think is a terrible thing to happen to anybody. And Ridley appears to be ghettoized in The Spectator. They are making an argument which doesn't seem to me to be completely ridiculous. I mean, maybe they're wrong, I don't know, but they don't seem to be ridiculous. Or am I wrong? Are they ridiculous and are they lying their heads off?
I don't think either of them are good faith actors, and I've argued with them and responded to them over many years. So on the other end, I think we need a proper rational debate about what we know about climate science and what that means for us and how much we spend it. And I'm not in favour of saying the science is sorted, because the science isn't sorted. Because I say it's got a lot worse over my career. And I think that's actually meant people are more complacent than they should be, and they're not looking at all of the science and all of the scientific information when they make decisions. And that's actually to the detriment of climate change. So there is no debate, we know everything, is not the right answer. We need to grow up. But that was partly in response to the politically motivated climate deniers. The reason I don't think Lomborg and Ridley are good faith actors in that debate, which is why it becomes a culture war, is that Lomborg has repeatedly tried to carve out a space for himself on the right and in the funders' space by downplaying the impact of climate change. You look at the maths he does, you look at the models he uses, the economics he uses. It's been debunked repeatedly by multiple proper academics and observers. He's not a proper academic. And he refuses to take their different answers. And so he's not a good faith actor. And Ridley, basically, he knows what he wants the answer to be. And so he pushes arguments which he thinks make sense. Some of them illuminate places where the mainstream needs to think harder and better. And that's kind of useful in that sense. But I would ask Lomborg and Ridley, well, what level of warming is safe? And what's your date for net zero? Because it's a stock flow problem. In the end, you have to get to net zero to stop us getting to completely devastating, catastrophic levels of climate change. No one argues that 7 degrees is not catastrophic, but if you just cut by half, you just get there half as quickly. And they have never said what level of warming they think was safe, and therefore when's the net zero date. I've never heard from either of them, perhaps I've missed it. But that's why I say they're bad faith actors, because then we could discuss, well, okay, is that a risk worth taking? What are we getting in return for taking a risk of 3 degrees, say, as opposed to 2 degrees, if actually the cost of those two different things is actually negative? It's cheaper to get to 2 than 3 degrees just on the cost of clean energy. Now, that wasn't true 15 years ago, because cost of energy's changed.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
But that's the conversation we should be having. But you need them to play in the game rather than just pot-shotting, which is what they tend to do.
But they can't be in the debate because they are excluded from mainstream media. The BBC, as far as I can make out, The Economist, the FT, will not host them. They are ghettoized to Fox and Spectator.
But Lombard was all over the mainstream media, and people did take him seriously. He was sponsored by The Economist. He set up The Economist unit on this until people realised that he wasn't a good faith actor. It's because he hasn't played a good faith game that he's been excluded. There's plenty of debate about climate sensitivity and the role of aerosols in climate models. And there's a big debate with Hansen saying, actually, he's underestimating climate sensitivity and it's twice as bad as people think it is. These are all debates about it being much worse than the average the IPCC is coming out with. There's not enough discussion of that, as far as I'm concerned.
That's an interesting point, because when you read the IPCC reports, they don't seem to depict scenarios of great catastrophe. They don't depict the outcomes that you see the protesters proclaiming. So you're right. If there is this great looming catastrophic disaster within 20 years or so, it's not in the IPCC reports.
You wouldn't use the IPCC methodology to do security analysis, because it would say the average likelihood of an invasion of Taiwan or Russia's invasion of Ukraine is 0.05% or something. That's not how you do analysis of existential threat. And this is the difference between science, which does what science does, and decision support. So I work as a security analyst in government. I've advised many governments on setting up their climate security analysis machinery. What you need to do then is say, okay, what's the worst case scenario, which is likely, tipping points in the climate system? When are those likely to be breached? Well, we used to think 4 degrees. Now we think somewhere between 1.5 and 2. What does that tell me about the science? It means I should be cautious to assume I've got lots of wriggle room. That should lead me to an approach to how much does it cost me to minimize an existential risk to my fundamental security and prosperity? And that leads you to a decision. Now, the IPCC doesn't do that, which is just normal security analysis. We do that on China, we do it on Russia, we do it on terrorism, on weapons proliferation. In fact, working with security analysts in the US and 3-star generals, we produced a whole paper in 2010 asking the question, if we took climate change as seriously as nuclear proliferation, how would we deal with it? And actually, you come out with a much more robust approach because the tail risks are so high and extraordinarily plausible. But that's a security analyst logic. It's not what the IPCC does. And that's some of the criticisms of the IPCC structure, that people are going to read directly off it, if they can read an answer out of the IPCC for what decision makers should do. That's never been the case. Decision makers need to make decisions under uncertainty, whereas the IPCC talks about averages and medians. A decision maker doesn't have the luxury to ignore catastrophic tail risk, like with pandemics. That's where I find the IPCC does give people some false security at times, because it fails to look at some of the work, for example, Chatham House is doing on the risk of 2 major food baskets in the world collapsing and what that would do for food availability in North Africa and the Middle East and the social and security consequences of that. Now, that's not what the IPCC has been doing. But that, I can tell you, is read pretty avidly in the Ministry of Defence and in Washington and other places when they're thinking about future stability scenarios around Europe.
So what should people be reading if not the IPCC reports? What are the best sets of information about these risks?
There is a useful amount of work done by think tanks like Chatham House and the Stockholm Institute for Peace and Resilience. And actually just reading the scenarios put out by the US National Security Council, National Intelligence Council on different scenarios gives you a bit more of the consequences. But I think, again, it's still a very emerging field because lots of the things that happened, for example, 2007-8, we saw droughts in the US, fires in Russia, both linked to climate change, leading to trade embargoes on grain, which pushed the price up and caused 36 countries to have significant social unrest, including the Arab Spring and lots of the Arab countries, where there's massive food importers. That was on nobody's radar because it involved cascading effects across 3 or 4 systems. And I think that's where we've been constantly surprised that relatively small changes in average temperatures can lead to rather large changes in extreme weather persistently. So instead of a 5-year drought, a 10 or 15-year drought, and that overwhelms coping capacity and that leads to massive social and stability multipliers. That's some of the work people are trying to get their heads around, which is not the usual way security analysts look at security. So one of the things we've struggled with is to get people whose main job is to look at the intent of an adversary and their capability to do you harm, whether they're a state actor or a non-state actor, and turn that into how is this interaction between environmental systems and human politics going to turn into strategic security risks for me, which have never been documented. It's a very different approach to achieving security, and that's why I think we're struggling to get a grip on it as a civilization.
To follow up on David's question, if the IPCC is not producing sufficiently broad or sufficiently terrifying scenarios for people to read, what should people be reading to get a better view, a more realistic and more accurate view of the scenarios that we might be facing in a few years?
If you read the National Intelligence Council of the US, DCDC, which is the UK military scenarios, some of the work that Brussels puts out.
Are those national intelligence and defence reviews publicly available?
Yeah, no, they're on websites. Also, academics like Tim Lenton at Exeter, who looks at tipping points in more detail, Chatham House to look at the security of food systems. There is a whole range of think tanks and analysts. Not all of their work is in the public domain, but most of it is. But again, I think one of the problems is it's very confusing for people. It's hard for them to get a grip. Mainstream media doesn't actually report this very much.
You surprise me, because The Guardian has made an official declaration that we're in a climate emergency. I think they're calling it a catastrophe now. So they seem to be quite keen on reporting it. And the BBC as well. And The Economist covers it in great length all the time.
Yeah. The hard thing we found talking to media editors, they say, well, we've done climate change. We've talked about the impacts. I actually think the Financial Times is one of the better. They've increased their reporting, and so the Washington Post, which looks a lot more at the kind of geopolitical, geoeconomic, such as they're trying to embed it inside an understanding of how it affects immediate decisions and immediate markets and choices and politics, which I think is easier for people to absorb. Because one of the things we found is people don't have stories about how climate change impacts human society, because until we did more climate science, we didn't really understand it in history books. Now, of course, we have a much better understanding of how various historical events have been driven by shifts in the climate. But most of that work is around 10 years old. So most of current decision makers learnt about the world politically and historically when we didn't understand climate as an actor. So they have no analogies. And as most things in the world are actually done by narrative and analogy, they find it very hard. They say, well, it's just more stuff going on. But what does it mean to me? What does it mean to things I care about? No one cares about climate for climate's sake. They care about it because it does something. So unless your country is going to be submerged by a very predictable sea level rise at a certain level of temperature, which is easy to understand, it's actually quite hard for decision makers or the general public to get a grip around this, because it is literally unprecedented, because we've never had this much climate change when we've had 8 billion people on the planet with sophisticated, globalized systems that are all independent. It is a massive experiment, and we are finding out what happens. It's very much an emergent understanding. It's not something we're very good at predicting or just absorbing as intelligent apes. It's so beyond what we evolved to be able to grip. We constantly find people find it so hard to contemplate at a planetary scale, which is not surprising. That's just who we are.
What we often say on this show, when we talk about other technological areas, is that people can sort of figure out linear change, but it's accelerating or exponential change that throws them, because we haven't had the evolutionary training in exponential change. And that comes to the subject you mentioned a couple of times, tipping points. For those listeners of ours who are not quite sure what's meant by a climate change tipping point or what might the consequences be, maybe you could just say a few things about that.
The metaphor of a tipping point is a seesaw. You push a seesaw up to a certain point, and then under its own weight, it tips over the other side. So for a while, you have to push up a seesaw, but then it goes and completes on the other side. And so basically it says, if we push a system too far, at a certain point, we lose control of it, and it will move to a new state under its own impetus. It doesn't mean it moves to the end state, but it moves. There is a certain bit of uncontrolled change. That could include a point where the Amazon dries out and all the trees die, which accelerates global warming. It could mean a climate system tipping point if Arctic ice completely melts, and that increases warming because of sea reflects back less heat than the ice, or methane in the tundra as the permafrost melts, that increases the rate of warming by a certain percentage, and that melts more tundra, more methane. So those are climate system tipping points where we get the relationship between the emissions we put in the atmosphere and the amount of warming accelerates irreversibly because we've gone over a tipping point. There's also social tipping points. So if we have repeated droughts in the 4 or 5 major breadbaskets of the world, so people start putting trade bans on quite regularly, people will start not believing in agricultural trade as a form of food security. And you will get a fundamentally different trade in agriculture. And there's a discussion that's going on at the moment. And quasi-imperialist, we already have countries in the Middle East buying up parts of Africa in order to secure their food supplies, and Japan and China, etc. That would be a social, kind of diplomatic tipping point. So there are Earth system tipping points, and there are also global economic and social tipping points, which basically mean once we've gone over them, we will get to a new state, which is much worse and it's very hard to come back from. And those are not usually modelled, neither the Earth system ones and definitely not the impacts ones, in the models that are used by the IPCC. They're kind of outside the normal climate models which are used to produce the predictions we have for impacts.
So you're not keen on lukewarmers. Let's try people towards the other end of the spectrum. The degrowth movement, Jason Hickel and people like that. Are you more aligned with them?
I am more aligned with perhaps their concerns about the impact of climate change on civilization, which I tend to be slightly more pessimistic about. I'm not aligned with them on their political project for a solution, because I can't see how you solve climate change through their prescriptions. I mean, in a way, some of the prescriptions are what we're doing already. So growing the economy while reducing impacts on the environment and pollution, yes, that's kind of the whole climate project. Reducing wasteful consumption, moving to repairing things rather than, we've had end-of-life vehicles directives in Europe for 15 years. We have just had a right to repair directive introduced in Europe. Circular economy is big. So yes, those are all sensible pieces. So that's part of what they say. So part of what they say is what we're doing already. And then the last bit, which I disagree with, is the rich world should grow less so the poor world can grow more, because we fundamentally can't detach GDP from emissions. I just think that's wrong. It's just fundamentally, biophysically wrong. We can not do it, which is a political choice, but to say we can't, we literally physically can't do it, which is the hard version of degrowth, is just wrong. And I think also, just because it's politically totally infeasible, it's actually worse for poor people in developing countries than the current strategy. So I think it's harmful and it's wrong. And it gives lots of ammunition for people on the right to say, look, we told you they were just communists dressed up in green clothing, and so you shouldn't do them. So it's politically harmful as well. So the modern degrowth movement, some of it's just old-fashioned sustainable development, but done not very well. And part of it is just quite authoritarianism, not very clever statism, which, as someone who argues a lot for increased state action to solve climate change, I have been called both an environmental Margaret Thatcher and environmental Stalin, which means I must be getting something right. But it's just statism for statism's sake, as opposed to saying, what are we trying to control? What are we trying to deliver? And in the end, I don't want to sacrifice democracy to solve climate change. I don't think that's a necessary choice. And I actually think it's a very dangerous place to go. And there's a lot of echoes of that authoritarianism in the degrowth movement, which I think is very dangerous. Something that's always been around in the environment movement. There's always been a strain of environmental authoritarianism and kind of anti-humanism in the environment movement on the fringes. Some of it not so near the fringes. It's certainly one of those cleavages between environmentalists, which is going to come out more over the next decade or so.
Yeah. There's an even more hardline version than Hickel, which is the school that says actually the only solution to climate change is to massively reduce the human population, which is even more authoritarian and scary. But then let's try another voice in the middle. I heard Mark Carney on a podcast a little while ago, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, now a major mover in kind of international climate change policy at government levels and big business levels, saying that actually the world is moving towards renewables much faster than he expected a few years ago when he started paying attention to it. And he's quite encouraged by the rate of progress. I keep reading down the years that every time the IEA makes a forecast about how much of the world's energy mix will be in renewables, they get it woefully wrong. They woefully underestimate the increase in the use of solar and wind. Are you at all aligned with him and encouraged by the progress we're making, or do you think he's overstating it?
No, he's right. We're 30 years cheaper in renewables than we thought we were going to be 10 years ago. I've worked on this for 30 years. When I started work, literally, the only people producing wind farms were Danes. The only people producing solar panels were NASA, and the electric cars were the Sinclair C5. And now we have a 1.7 trillion clean economy in those issues. A techno-optimist I might be, but the technology has performed a lot better than even the most technological optimistic person out there. Thank God, because the science has got equally worse at the kind of similar rate. If the science of the 1990s had been correct, I would be out of a job and doing something else now because it would all be solved. We'd have had to 2100 to eliminate emissions and we would be fine. We wouldn't need to do virtually any policy, it would just happen by itself. The massive change over the last 10 years has been the cost competitiveness of solar, wind, and electric vehicles. We still need to deploy them at a rate we've never deployed before, but that's a lot easier when you're offering people something that's cheaper, as opposed to before we were offering people something that was expensive and harder to put in.
Yeah.
Without that, we would not be having this discussion. We would be on a 3 to 4 degree territory.
Don't you think, Nick, that that story is underreported? Because something I suspect, I don't know this, I suspect that the great majority of people in the UK, let's say, and Europe, believe firmly that global warming, climate change is a real issue and it needs to be solved, but they're confused and they are rendered a bit hopeless by a constant narrative of it's a disaster, we're all going to boil, our children won't live to a ripe old age. Whereas actually there is quite a lot of good news. And if there was more good news reported, then people would think, oh, this is good. This is a problem we can solve. Let's allocate lots of resource and effort to it so we can solve it.
Yeah.
Rather than just feeling hopeless and then giving up.
I think you're right. The biggest issue we have is a lack of agency. What's the point of me doing this if China's doing that or whatever? And I think outside the Financial Times, it is not reported. The Financial Times is a lot more optimistic, even though it's quite a hardliner in terms of the impacts. But it also sees what's going on the cutting edge of investment and it knows the progress. And so a lot of what we think is necessary, we do a lot of work in this area, is making people understand those facts and the incredible technological tailwinds. And the fact is, people only really started taking engineering of these technologies seriously in the last 5 to 10 years. And there's a lot more engineers on the planet and scientists than there ever used to be with China and India. There's huge headroom in the physics to get the technology better. So I'm expecting that tailwind to carry on blowing. It's not like it's maxed out. And that gives us the opportunity to fundamentally go faster in a way that is good for people and is good for their economies and gives them that sense that something can be done. And that's why I come back to my biggest problem with the degrowthers is that fundamentally they don't have any agency because they don't have a plan to win. You look at the policy prescriptions, some of them are stuff we're doing already, so it doesn't really make a point. But the rest of it is just like, how does that deploy clean energy 6 times faster in the major emerging economies of the world? It just doesn't. Stopping people fly private jets, agree, not agree, it has nothing to do with how Indonesia decarbonises its grid, which is a massive diplomatic, technological, engineering, economic project, which has to do with Indonesian politics and approaches. It's not saying it's easy. We have to do some fundamental changes to our society. But compared to where we were 15 years ago, I'm a lot more hopeful on the transition side. But again, this issue is the science has got worse really quickly as well. So that balance between the fear and the hope is a tricky one to navigate when one looks at things really objectively. Because what you don't know. I don't know, and I do this as a living, and I do not know where we are. So you just have to crack on. Otherwise, what's the point? You can't sit there and mull. Let's just get it done as fast as possible, because that gives us the greatest chance of avoiding catastrophe and being able to manage the impacts we can't avoid.
So when you say we must crack on, what should we be doing? You said you were an advocate of state interventions or state actions to help. What do you think are the most important changes that need to take place so that we can accelerate the adoption of clean economy and stop us reaching these potential tipping points?
The most important thing in the next couple of years, firstly, is completing the phase down of coal power stations everywhere. We've stopped building them ever outside China. That was purposeful. We now need to start driving them down in all the major economies, which is about accelerating renewables and grid build out. And to do that in a large part of the world, we need to provide affordable finance. Because with various impacts of COVID and the Ukraine war and prices, lots of countries have high debt. They can't borrow in global markets. They're paying high interest rates, which are there to control inflation in America. But they impact the cost of capital in South Africa on renewables, and these are capital-intensive machines. But that's where, if we put a significant amount more capital in the global banks we own, the World Bank and others, we can provide lower cost capital for investments which are economic, but currently they can't get finance for, and accelerate the takeout. And that's something which has been building up over the last year. Next year is going to see a big push on this. But if you're going to ask Indonesia or South Africa or India to rapidly change their economy, they've got to think it's not going to displace investment in other things they need to do, housing, roads, etc. They've got to think they can access the technology, but not just the technology, they want to build it in their own countries, and they want to be able to export stuff to us as well. And so there's a finance play, there's a trade play, and there's helping them industrialize. Now, some of those things go against perhaps our short-term interest. Perhaps we want to sell them wind farms. That's where some of these tough questions come out, which is you might be willing to provide them with cheap money, which they pay back. It's not for free. But are we prepared to open up our markets to them so they can sell us parts of electric vehicles? Because that's what's going to incentivize them. We can't lock them out of the new clean revolution. And that's where some of the other state action, like the Inflation Reduction Act or China's 2025 vision or the European Union's industrial policy, is locking out some of those countries from the green revolution, from benefiting from it. So there's a careful balance. Yes, we need to push hard to move. We have to do it in a way that everybody feels they're going to get a slice of the pie, because that's what's going to incentivize them to make the changes we need to do. That's the dance we're in at the moment as we reach the cusp of clean energy displacing fossil energy. Fossil energy use should peak in the next 2 years. Then people's ideas of our controllability of the fossil fuel economy will really change. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Is China part of the problem or part of the solution here?
As usual with China, it's both, because it's so large. As the world's largest emitter by 2 times and the world's largest investor in clean energy, again, I think China should peak its emissions in the next 2 years. China then becomes part of the solution. It will still be part of the problem because it has to run down its emissions, and it's got a lot of very young coal plants. China will damage us more from its coal plants than any military thing it could ever do, but we don't take its coal plants as seriously as we do its discussions around Taiwan. But China has just invested the last 2 years 50% of its state investment in clean manufacturing. So it now can manufacture enough solar panels and enough EVs to keep the world on track to climate change. But of course, the world doesn't want to just buy Chinese EVs and solar panels.
And one of its car companies has just overtaken Tesla as the world-leading producer of EVs.
But they were smart. We worked with them 15 years ago on their industrial strategy, and they looked at the world and said, no one's going to let us take over and export cars because BMW and Daimler and VW control that. No one's going to let us take over all these high value-added brand industries like Apple, etc. We're going to go to places where no one exists. So we're going to go to EVs, we're going to go to renewables, and we're going to build up those industries because there's no incumbents in Western countries, and that's where we make our money. And they did it, and they won it. Good on them. They had the foresight to do that, and that's ended up being good for the world. We will have trade wars with them about it, but that's a very second, third tier issue compared to controlling climate change in terms of our national interest. It's a good problem to have when you're fighting over who controls the new clean economy. I wasn't expecting to see that this decade.
Yeah. It's interesting that your focus on solutions is all government-led. I guess that's inevitable given the kind of world you live in. I imagine you probably would also say that we all have a role to play. We should eat less meat and fly less and so on. But do you think actually it's mostly going to happen at the state level or not going to happen there? Or do you think that individuals have a major role to play?
It's a timing issue. I used to get very frustrated because both some of the most deep green people, but also the fossil fuel companies were very keen to make it about individual choice when individual choice was responsible for a very small amount of people's emissions. We needed to get the structures right so they could buy clean energy and just have clean energy as standard and clean cars as standard and live in an efficient building and be able to renovate their building. All those things needed to be done. Once everybody has a heat pump and an electric vehicle and China's reducing its emissions, then talking about lifestyles and eating and things will become a much more sensible discussion to have. Also, we'll have a clearer idea of how close we are to those tipping points. But at the moment, having a discussion, eat a little less meat. People are eating less meat anyway. It's a good way to cut emissions. But fundamentally, if China's still building coal power stations, really that is an irrelevance. I would prefer people were making their climate impact known by talking to their pension fund and voting for governments who would invest more externally in climate action in countries that can't afford renewables than worry about their meat intake. But by the end of this decade, assuming other things are going well, that will start to become a really serious part of the conversation. If you just ask people now to do that, they will come back and say, quite rightly, why are you taxing meat? Let's do something real. Let's not just ask people to change. Let's get permission to tax meat. as opposed to low carbon alternatives, or tax meat by carbon content. I just don't think we're ready for that conversation yet. There's a lot we need to do to take people on that journey. I don't want to give ammunition to people to push back on these issues. It's a sprinty marathon. We have to move really, really fast, but it is a multi-decadal process. And there's no point asking questions where you know the answer is not going to be what you want. Let's think of when that's the right thing to do. That's the way we're going to go on that. And hopefully that's going to happen quite quickly. But people are very wise. They can smell hypocrisy. So let's tax private jets before we ask people to tax meat. There's a very strong equality issue here, not just between countries, but within countries. We need to get the social contract right for this transition, because people need to know they're going to be protected from climate change, from the shifts in the economy. They need to know who's going to pay for it, and they need to know who's going to have a say. And at the moment, I don't think that is clear in the UK. I don't think that's clear across Europe, US, or anywhere. So we've got a lot of work to do. We've got to build the permissions and the right conversation to get there. That's not a problem with the people. That's a problem of our political class to frame this in the right way, as if they're serious about solving it.
And are the political class listening to you? Are they likely to take this more seriously and do something real as opposed to just gestures and virtue signaling?
I think they do get it for multiple reasons. Some get it because they really care about climate change. Others worry about competitiveness with China and other things. How many politicians really see this as the reason they go into politics? Not as many as I would like. And it is very different compared to, say, the ones who go into politics to do defence or education or health. We haven't got a strong bench. If you look at the people who are involved in various environmental parliamentary groups, we haven't got in the UK a stronger bench as I'd like, or across Europe or in the US. So we're building a Republican bench. That is part of the political change. I think compared to the number of people outside Parliament who care about this, who are in mainstream jobs, when you talk to accountants and architects and engineers, we work a lot with professional groups and educators. This is something that really motivates people as a purpose for their professional life to make a difference. And the political class seems a little detached from that, I must admit. And I think it's partly because this is a multi-decadal problem. The political class tends to move from election to election. And this is never going to be a top election issue, except when it's a problem. But it's something that is political and requires a long-term focus on getting it right. So in that way, the political class struggles to fit it into their model of winning and to what they do. This is why certainly one of the things we're looking at is how do we construct that whole of societal politics. So they have to respond to the culture of people in the country wanting this to happen, even if they're not going to get lots of electoral brownie points for it, because it's just something that people think is the right thing to do. Like, people don't get elected over defence. They lose elections over defence, but they expect defence to be done properly so it actually defends us. So a similar attitude should be on climate. We expect climate change action to be done in a way that is fair and is effective and delivers a result. And that's a baseline for a competent government. It's not something you should get extra reward for. But none of the political tribes really own climate as an issue.
Arguably, it shouldn't be a tribal issue anyway. Partly the problems in America is it became Al Gore's issue and therefore a Democrat issue, and any self-respecting Republican was embarrassed to talk about belief in climate change.
The US is the only country in the world, thank God, where it is as bifurcated as that. So it is mainly a bipartisan issue. People disagree a lot on individual, how much state, how much market, who pays the cost. That's fine. That's good politics. As long as they're delivering the outcome, there's lots of politics you can fight on tribal grounds. But like national defence, there's a final outcome we need, which is we need to live in a climate-stable world where we are protected from the impacts of climate change and we benefit from the new economy that's created to solve it. Those are bipartisan objectives, even if you could meet them in multiple different ways, depending on your flavour of party or political persuasion.
And you summarise it, the task is a sprinty marathon, which I'd like. That's a good one to take away. Nick, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us on the London Futurists podcast.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. Lots to think about.